case of the Menendez brothers was one that divided America as soon as the media got a hold of it. Two charming, good-looking boys arrested over the murder of their parents. A mansion in Beverly Hills and a $14 million inheritance, the whole situation read like a movie. But underneath the preconceptions of a perfect American family gone wrong was something a lot darker. And over the years, the case has posed the question, who were the real monsters, the boys, or the ones that created them? Now, before we go into the story, I'm OriKat and welcome to my channel. I deliver cases to you in the dramatisation format, so if that's something you enjoy, you'll be happy to know we upload once a week. As always, my aim is to give a voice to the victims and remember them as they were. So with that, let us begin. Jose Enrique Menendez was born in 1944 to an upper-middle-class family in Cuba. He had two older sisters, Teresita and Marta, the age gap between himself and Teresita being 5 years. Growing up in a family with high expectations, Jose always knew he wanted to make something of himself. His mother was a well-known swimmer who had been elected into the Cuban Hall of Fame, and his father was a renowned soccer player who also had his own accounting firm. Out of all the siblings, Jose was adored by his mother. She talked him up all the time and spoiled him. In 1960, Jose moved from Cuba to the United States. At the age of 16, just after the end of the Cuban Revolution, his parents sent him over there for a fresh start. The family were feeling unsafe under the rule of Fidel Castro, who was well known for penalising the middle and upper classes over their wealth, whilst he kept the lower classes down below with restrictions so there was no chance they could move up. So Jose was sent away with only the clothes on his back, and his two older sisters would follow in his footsteps later on. He first arrived in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and without a single penny to his name, Jose struggled to speak English. But determined to exceed, Jose enrolled in the local high school and worked part-time to get his hands on any piece of money he could. As a result of this, it meant he worked tirelessly on being able to perfect English. Jose never achieved his goal of attending an Ivy League college. He had the qualifications at this point, but not really the background that would make him particularly recruitable. So after this, Jose promised himself that when he had children in the future, they would continue and complete his goals. Knowing he had to enroll somewhere, Jose lived in the attic of a cousin's home until he eventually earned a swimming scholarship for college. Consequently, he attended the Southern Illinois University, where he met a girl called Kitty. Now, to tell you all about Kitty, we have to start with the fact that she was the youngest out of 4 children, from an upper middle class family in South Chicago. Her father owned a prolific air conditioning business and her mother was stay at home. But much like the negative atmosphere her future kids would grow into, Kitty experienced the brutality of human nature quite early in her life. Her father was abusive and often made a show of beating their mother in front of the 4 girls. And then as this carried on, before Kitty left for grammar school, her father left her mother to be with another woman. Forced to be a single parent with 4 children, Kitty's mother had to take a job at the United Airlines at Midway Airport. This eventually took a toll on Kitty's mother, leading to the woman becoming bitter and suicidal. As a consequence, throughout her childhood, Kitty was a very withdrawn and sad child. And this was reflected even more when she went into high school, where she struggled to make friends and make connections with people. Though because of everything that had happened in her younger years, Kitty promised herself that when she would meet her future husband, she would never divorce him, no matter what, because she was a result of what happened when parents got a divorce. When Kitty started at Southern Illinois University, she quickly won the Miss Lornoke pageant beauty queen. Not only this, but in her junior years she was working on broadcasting to eventually be able to work in drama and entertainment. So during the course of Jose and Kitty's relationship, Jose wasn't really fitting in with the whole college scene. But determined to keep up with the pace of the other students, Jose eventually pulled out of the athletic program to be able to focus more on his studies. Jose and Kitty were known to be inseparable in college, both enjoying what the other one brought to the table. Jose, for example, thought that winning a pretty, stereotypical American girl meant he was establishing himself better within the country. What it meant to become a proper American, so to speak. Differently, Kitty loved Jose's hard-working nature and drive. She too, like him, felt very disparate from all their peers. So on the whole, she just found Jose so much more superior to the others. I personally think this was what made their relationship work so well. Kitty thought Jose was amazing, and Jose had a relationship which would allow him to blend in and make his ethnicity less noticeable as to not hold him back in the future. Their relationship did cause a lot of problems for both of their families. Kitty's parents were unhappy that she had chosen a Cuban teenager to be her future husband, whereas Jose's parents thought that Kitty was beneath their social status due to the fact that she had come from a divorced home. Not to mention, they thought at 19 Jose was too young to get married. Throughout college, Jose had dreams of making it big in the business world, and Kitty really fed into these dreams and believed that there would be big things for her too in the future. On the campus, the two of them drew a lot of stares, but both of them were resolute in ignoring what their peers thought of their relationship. You see, during the time they attended college in the 1960s, Southern Illinois was still pretty conservative and wary of people with different ethnicities. It just wasn't somewhere other races mixed. Regardless, the next 3 years went by quick and Jose eloped with Kitty as soon as they graduated. Kitty left college with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Communications. 1963, and the two of them moved to New York, where Jose had originally got an accounting degree from Queen's College. It was there Kitty took up a job as a teacher. Though her dreams to become a broadcaster quickly started to fade as she took a step back from her own goals to fully support her husband's career. Ironically, as the years went by, this soon made her as sour as her own mother had been. This feeling was worsened 5 years later, on the 10th of January 1968, when Joseph Lyle Menendez was born. As he grew up, he would choose to be called Lyle instead. When Lyle was born, Kitty had to quit her teaching job to become a full-time mother. It wasn't too long after this, Jose followed the progression of his career, and the family moved to Blackwood, New Jersey. Then 2 years later, on the 27th of November 1970, Erik Galen Menendez was born. 8 years after the family had moved to New Jersey, in the summer of 1976, the boys had one of their cousins come over, Diane Vandermolen. She visited them frequently. At the time, Lyle was 8 and Erik was 6. She was close to both brothers, though she was a more similar age to Lyle. Whilst they were sitting up in Lyle's room one day, just the two of them, Lyle looked really worried about something, like he was breaking the rules, so to speak. But in a low voice, Lyle confessed something horrific that no child should have to talk about. He admitted that he was being sexually abused by his father. Though at the time, Diane may have not understood quite what the ramifications of that news meant at that age. But she could see how scared Lyle was, and of course she became concerned. In fact, she believed him straight away, which suggests one of two things. Either she'd seen enough glimpses of Jose's behaviour to think that Lyle was telling the truth, or she was just hanging on to the words of her friend. Regardless, even though Lyle wanted to keep it a secret, Diane thought if anyone could help him, it would be his mother. So Diane approached Kitty and told her how worried she was for Lyle and what he had actually told her. In response, Kitty became very cold and defensive with Diane. She didn't even really listen to her and just said that she shouldn't believe everything she hears and that Lyle was lying. Again, because of her young age, Diane wouldn't have understood the consequences that would have come from telling Kitty, but she soon saw them. While she was there, it seemed Kitty had informed Jose of what Diane had confided in her about. The last Diane heard from Lyle that day, he was seized by his father and locked up in his room. From this point onwards, Lyle never spoke about it with Diane again. Little did anyone know in the household that alongside Lyle's accusations, Jose had been seeing different women on the side. Especially by 1978, when he'd started the longest affair he'd had so far with a businesswoman named Louise. During all this, Jose had no plans to break it off with Kitty, nor did he have any desire to tell her about it. He was convinced he still loved Kitty, but that she wasn't giving him what he desired. They thought that they were slowing down and were a shell of themselves since having children. What Louise offered him, like many other women that Jose had been with, was that they rubbed his ego. They told him how great he was, and this was something that Jose was lacking from home. Unlike Kitty, it is unclear whether the boys picked up on something going on at this point. In New Jersey, Jose and Kitty's sons attended Princeton Day School. It was a private coeducational school that served kindergarten up to the 12th grade, around 17 to 18 years old. At school, Lyle was said to be particularly immature compared to his classmates. He struggled to pay attention to things and his schoolwork was average because of this. Even at 14, he was still sleeping with his soft toys, but what was even more troublesome was that at that time he was still wetting the bed. Being the younger sibling, he often liked to emulate him, and whilst they were at the same school, Erik kind of lived in Lyle's shadow. Like Lyle, Erik's schoolwork was average too. In fact, throughout most of his school time, Kitty completed a lot of Erik's homework for him, though it is unknown whether she did this for Lyle. Though I would think she likely didn't, I think she saw Lyle as more her husband's successor, which was backed up by Jose establishing that he wanted Lyle to be the next head of their family legacy. Erik was aware of this, of course. He often felt like the spare, because of the lack of attention from his father at the time. Still quite young, this led to him feeling sad and isolated. Hence he was the shyer one of the two boys. Though all these feelings of being excluded reflected more on Jose than they did on Lyle. Because as I've said, Erik worshipped Lyle throughout his childhood and even adopted him as a care dependent. Unlike his father, Erik had full faith that his brother would always protect him. At school, neither boy had many friends. They were known to be loners and were happy enough to indulge in their own inside jokes all the time. They reckon they only needed each other. It wasn't too long during their time at Princeton Day School that the actual school got in touch with their parents. They told their parents that they suspected Lyle and Erik might have learning disabilities due to how hard they found it to concentrate. Yet Jose wouldn't hear anything of this and was determined to let them go on as they were. Therefore, his behaviour and discipline at home didn't change, causing the boys to develop some awful habits. You see, at home, Jose literally had rules for everything. He just completely liked to micromanage. He decided what the two boys could eat, who they could spend time with, what they read, and even what they thought. He expected them to account for every hour of the day until they went to bed. So during their childhood and growing up, the boys really did live in a very militarised environment. The intense pressure the two boys felt being exerted on them every day led to them developing a stutter, a habit of grinding their teeth, bad tempers, and awful stomach aches. So no wonder their educational performance was lacking. Their parents just didn't care and didn't see what was right in front of them. Examples of scenarios that built pressure were most prevalent during the time the two boys were in grade school. Jose often posed questions about the world's current events at the dinner table. Occasionally Erik was allowed to answer, but during these interactions, Kitty and Erik were kind of left out of it. All of the inquisition fell onto Jose's probably more favoured child, Lyle. If the questions were answered wrong, Jose would quickly use his temper and often snap at Lyle. As the brothers grew older, these questions became more complex. And considering the school believed the boys had a stunted learning growth, this just really wasn't easy for them. At some point, Jose decided that each of the brothers would pick one sport each to excel in. He encouraged them to pick solo sports that wouldn't require them to be members of a team. Jose's opinion was that teamwork with other boys and the coach would challenge his own authority, and eventually someone would call into question the way he was raising his sons. Therefore, by the time Lyle was 12 and Erik was 10, they had both picked tennis. During his school years, from the start of his teens upwards, Lyle did become quite the tennis star in his school. Though he would never go on to have the talent his brother had, he was relatively successful. But unlike his brother, who was so much more committed to focusing on the sports he liked to take part in, Lyle had a developing interest in girls. In fact, Lyle met his first girlfriend at the age of 15 in 1983. She was called Stacy Feldman. Lyle described her as being innocent and chaste, an untouched angel away from all the negative energy from his own home. For their first date, Lyle and Stacy went to the movies, which might be why they hold so much significance for Lyle later on. He as a person was very engrossed at them at the time, and Stacy often wondered if he had trouble telling fact from fiction. This successful outing encouraged Lyle to go out with her more and more, despite the admonishment from his parents, because it was something, more specifically his father, couldn't control. He finally had a way to escape, even if it was for a little while. Not that Stacy would have been welcomed in his house anyway. Like how all of Lyle's future girlfriends would be treated, Jose and Kitty just couldn't stand her. Kitty especially often referred to any girls Lyle took an interest in as being cheap and whorish. During all the time they spent together, Lyle and Stacy talked many times about one day getting married and starting a family together. And Lyle loved how committed their relationship was turning out to be. A real sense of loyalty where he didn't have to keep watching his back all the time. In fact, over the course of their relationship, Lyle spoilt Stacy with so many lavish gifts. But during the end of the summer break, this temporary fantasy came crashing down for Lyle. Unfortunately, Stacy told Lyle that their talk of the future was literally just talk. She was really excited to go to college, and she wanted to go there with a fresh start and not have anything shackling her down. She believed they were too young to get married anyway. During the early 1980s, Lyle put off going to college because of things happening within the home, more specifically due to how Jose's career was progressing. By this time, Jose had worked his way up from washing dishes to becoming a successful entertainment executive. The opportunity had originally risen from working at Artisan Entertainment, aka International Video Entertainment at the time. Part of the reason he had moved up in his career so quickly was because a lot of his co-workers described him as being cutthroat. They said he was vicious and patronising, always trying to make others feel inferior. Henceforth, he was made the newly appointed head of RCA Records. This was a big job opportunity prompted by the fact that the company was looking for new management, considering the latest artists they'd signed were overpaid and ageing. Jose took it upon himself to add some new blood into the mix, leading to him having an involvement in signing Duran Duran, the Eurythmics, Jefferson Starship, and the Brazilian boy band called Menudo. It is worth noting at RCA, Jose's ethics were brought into question. He often practiced shipping large quantities of albums to record stores in order to make the sales appear much larger than they were. Though to keep up to date with the sudden increase of income, Jose did start writing his will. In his will, he stated that if anything was to happen to himself and Kitty, then the boys would get all of their money. Only a year after Jose got the new job, Kitty found out about the multiple affairs he had been having, including his longest one with Louise. Because of this, Jose broke it off with his mistress. Presumably once Kitty found out about this, the boys did too, because that night she stormed out of the house in a blind rage and didn't return for a week. Jose did eventually manage to persuade her to return, but instead of apologising or acting remorseful or telling her how much he loved her, he simply just put her through a guilt trip instead. He told her that the boys needed a mother, and if she left them, she would have failed them as a parent. 4 years later, in 1985, at the age of 41, Jose had finally built up to becoming the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for RCA Records' worldwide operations. Though as hard as he worked, he was never able to completely turn around RCA Records like people expected of him. A year after, in 1986, Jose's unethical tactics came back to bite him. The company were forced to honour $25 million in returned albums. Despite this, Jose's career continued on an upwards trajectory. He was well into working in the movie business, therefore it required him to move his family out to Beverly Hills. It is worth stating that this move wasn't okay with Kitty, considering she felt she'd built her life around New Jersey. She didn't want to leave all her friends behind, but Jose gave her no choice. So already devastated and disillusioned over all of her husband's affairs, on top of having to move to a place she didn't want to go to, Kitty became depressed, prompting her to turn to drinks and drugs to cope with it. During this period, she frequently had suicidal thoughts. Different to his family, before the big move, Lyle was prompted to focus more on his future, considering now he was 18, he didn't actually have to go with them. But when Lyle thought about his future, he just really didn't feel like he would fit into college. Instead, his dreams were more aligned with opening his own restaurant with his father's backing. But unfortunately, Jose wanted his son to take the same path as him, therefore Lyle felt he had no choice but to apply to Princeton. He was promptly rejected, therefore he enrolled in the local college, and submitted another application which would allow him to attend Princeton in the 1987 school year. Jose and Kitty kept track of what Lyle was doing over in New Jersey, and it seemed like while he was waiting to hear back from Princeton, he met a waitress at the local restaurant called Jamie Pisarcik. She was 5 years older than Lyle, but they had bonded over their shared interest of tennis. She played it too. Therefore, the two of them began dating. As expected, Jose and Kitty did not like Jamie at all. They believed that she was just dating Lyle because she knew he had wealthy parents and had set her sights on their money. Lyle was finally accepted into Princeton in 1987 like he had planned, but this was more on the grounds of his ethnicity and his ability to play tennis rather than his actual school grades. It was during this period that Lyle and Jamie announced that they were engaged, and this angered Jose considering he thought at 19 Lyle was too young to get married. To make matters even worse, just before Lyle was due to start Princeton, Jamie got a job as a tennis coach in Alabama. This prompted Lyle to follow her for a small vacation. Unbeknownst to Lyle, in secret, Jose had arranged to sponsor Jamie on a European tennis tour. His thinking was that once Jamie was out of the picture, Lyle could concentrate on Princeton without any distractions. Unfortunately for Jose, he was wrong, and Lyle followed Jamie on an impromptu trip to Europe. Lyle did manage to get back in time to start Princeton, and had to sign his final slip of admission. Freshmen had to sign a letter promising to obey the honour code, something that had been in place at Princeton since 1893. Despite knowing he had flaky behaviour, Lyle signed it without worrying about the wording. He thought that if he got into trouble, he had learnt sufficiently from his father how to get out of those situations. In fact, his father had always advertised that the best way to get ahead was sometimes to take the more dirtier path. It was alright to lie, cheat and steal as long as you didn't get caught. The house Jose bought was on one of the most exclusive streets in Beverly Hills. Located on 772 Elm Drive, the mansion was Mediterranean style and had 23 rooms. At different times, the street had hosted the likes of Michael Jackson. Not only this, but it had been previously rented out to the likes of Prince and Elton John. Whilst they were settling in, Jose quickly became known as a persistent and strong-willed man that would work his children to the bone to get what his family deserved. Once the family were officially settled in Beverly Hills, Erik attended the local high school in 1987. 17 at the time, Erik was originally apprehensive about going to a school on his own, whilst Lyle was back in New Jersey. But with time, he managed to make an identity for himself that even garnered his father's interest. Unlike the lack of friends he had at his last school, Erik had started developing a really close group of friends. Jose, on the other hand, didn't like any of these boys. He thought they were loud, cocky and rebellious. Notably, he thought Erik copied their values and behaviour. Erik's friends knew how close he was to Lyle, and they had even met Lyle on several occasions outside of school. And contrary to what Jose thought, Erik's friends knew Erik's true nature. They saw Lyle to be really aloof and witty, just someone who could walk into a room and command attention. Whereas in contrast, Erik was a lot more sensitive and quiet, not like the disrespectful troublemaker that Jose presumed him to be. Erik's friends did conclude, though, that Lyle did seem to be the stronger personality and perhaps the bigger influence in their relationship. Throughout Erik's time attending high school in Beverly Hills, especially during his first year, Kitty brought up concerns that she was worried about his sexual orientation. It seemed like she was using Lyle as a measure, even though she disapproved of his relationships. She was particularly worried that Erik wasn't girl crazy. Despite Erik telling her that he was happy how he was, Kitty wouldn't hear of it. And she told him to prove it to her, he had to find a girlfriend within the next 6 months. As his mum wished, Erik did find a girlfriend, perhaps a year or 2 older than himself. And he liked her well enough, but the girl could tell that Erik just wasn't really interested in her. It was quite clear he was using her as a way to get his parents off his back. At a party Erik attended with his new girlfriend, they soon got into an argument later that night. This prompted Erik to be the first one to leave the room and consequently lock her in there. He ignored her shouts to be let out until after a while he relented and released her. As you might guess, that was the end of their relationship. Later on, the girl would admit to her friends what it was really like going out with Erik, because she thought he did put up a really convincing front of confidence and arrogance, but she knew there was something troubling him underneath. Something darker that he just couldn't share. Despite continuing the trend of receiving average grades throughout high school, Erik found he really did have a good talent for sport. This prompted him to not only join his school's swimming team, but the school's tennis team too. Though it could be said out of the 2 sports, Erik enjoyed tennis more because he was better at it. In fact, his innate skill had been a lot more remarkable than Lyle's had ever been, and this was even acknowledged by his dad. Now, Erik's inclination for sport really excited Jose, because, as I said earlier, his parents were known for their athletic prowess back in Cuba. So naturally, Jose saw this as another thing he could manage, like his entertainment company. A combination of Erik's skill and Jose's obsessive training eventually led to Erik being ranked 44th in the US for juniors. This meant he was considered a really great tennis player for his age. Unfortunately, Erik didn't find quite as much success in swimming. The swim coach in particular was always worried about him when he turned up for training. As the swim coach told it, Jose was too overzealous and competitive. He tried absolutely everything to make Erik better, but it was having the opposite effect. The swim coach believed that Erik was really low in confidence due to the way his father trained him and shouted at him, and that this low confidence resulted into feelings of Erik believing he wasn't good enough. Consequently, this affected his swimming performance and eventually would bleed into his tennis matches. Towards the end of the school year, Erik obtained another girlfriend called Janice, and for once she was someone that Jose and Kitty actually liked. And then through tennis, Erik had finally met who he considered his best friend outside of Lyle. His friend was called Craig Signorelli, the current captain of the tennis team. Erik and Craig used to spend a lot of time together, including this one notable time where Erik was busy writing away on his own project. Craig often stole glances at it, but on the whole, he was more or less busy doing his own thing. When Erik was finally done, he presented what he was working on to Craig, and it turned out to be a screenplay he had wrote titled Friends. It was a 62-page thriller about a son who, upon reading his family's will, realised that he would receive $175 million. In the plotline, the son murdered his family to get the money before he would be killed himself. Craig obviously saw this as a joke, just something Erik had pulled from the top of his head, though it did make him wonder why something with such dark subject matter would be called quite an upbeat title like Friends. So a year after the family moved to Beverly Hills in 1988, Erik and Lyle partook in a string of burglaries in the area. They did this when they found the time after school. They targeted Calabasas homes owned by friends of their parents. From their hauls, they were amazed over the amount of money and jewellery they collected. This was largely because most of the money they saw at home came from Jose, and they were only allowed to use it when Jose allowed it. So for them, finally having their own spending money, despite where it had come from, just felt so liberating. They had grown up in such a strict household that didn't allow any time for fun, that this to them was a way better alternative than asking Jose for handouts. During the course of their burgling spree, Lyle and Erik robbed $100,000 worth of stolen items. This was technically enough to be considered grand theft burglary. Los Angeles County Sheriff's detective, who was investigating the robberies at the time, saw a break in the case when Erik was stopped for a driving violation in Calabasas. From this, the sheriff found some of the stolen property in Erik's trunk, including a safe that had been taken from one of the targeted houses. Later, the sheriff found out that the reason he had found Erik with the safe was because the boys had started to feel guilty about the whole thing. Therefore, Erik had set on his way to return the safe to the house, only he had accidentally driven up to the wrong one. When Jose found out, he was absolutely furious about all the thieving, though he didn't want his sons to spend any time in jail, though I think this was more about how it would reflect on himself. At the time, Jose hired Gerald Chalev, who was a well-respected criminal defense attorney. Chalev was able to come to an agreement with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office that Lyle would be absolved of all participations in the crimes if Erik took full responsibility. This was because Erik was still considered a juvenile with no previous criminal records, so they knew the charges wouldn't be very severe. Jose wrote a check of $11,000 to cover the cost of the stolen goods. He couldn't return any of the items because the brothers had already got rid of them. Erik was sentenced to community service with the homeless in exchange for avoiding jail time. Additionally, he was put in touch with his court-ordered therapist, Jerome Oziel. After this nightmare, Jose concluded that it was of a result of the influence of Erik's friends and Princeton's influence over Lyle. He wouldn't take any accountability for his son's actions or let them take any either. Which is ironic considering that most children and teenagers learn what is acceptable behaviour from their parents. It was also during this time Lyle was placed on academic probation due to his low grades. This eventually resulted in him being suspended for plagiarism. At this point, Lyle really did want to give up on college. He was finding it hard and pressuring, and he just didn't feel like he fit into such a structured lane. He still wanted to open his own restaurant where he would be his own boss, but Jose wouldn't hear of it. Instead, to teach Lyle some discipline, Jose made it so Lyle would work under him in his workplace, until they waited for his suspension to be cleared. Lyle had to call his father boss and was only allowed to speak to him if he made an appointment. During his time working there, Lyle just didn't really like the atmosphere in his father's workplace. It was an awful, tense environment to work in. Jose constantly tried to belittle and humiliate his peers. Eventually, Lyle's lack of motivation to do this extra work ended up in him getting fired. This was largely because Lyle had taken the time to skip work days just so he could play tennis. At this point, after having previously been suspended from Princeton over plagiarism accusations, when Lyle returned to the college, he started dating a 30-year-old model called Chrissy. She was 9 years older than Lyle, and Jose absolutely hated her. Troubles continued to follow the Menendez family right into the summer of 1988. Chrissy revealed that she was pregnant with Lyle's child, and Lyle wasn't too panicked by this because he had always dreamed of having his own family, not to mention he was financially stable. Of course, Jose was furious over this perceived stain on his legacy, therefore he intimidated Chrissy to get an abortion and then paid her off to cut all ties with Lyle. At this point, Lyle's grades had dipped to worrying lows. and he'd been suspended from his family's country club by joyriding on a golf cart. Throughout all of this, Jose and Kitty were at a loss. They just didn't know what had gone wrong with their sons, and were adamant that it had nothing to do with their pressurising parenting tactics. So as a last resort to get back at the boys for embarrassing him, Jose threatened to have them taken out of the will. A year later, on the 19th of July, 1889, Kitty had started going to therapy herself. In fact, she was using the same therapist as Erik. She told the psychiatrist Oziel that she didn't feel safe with her sons. She thought them to be sociopathic and that she didn't understand why they were so cold and aggressive with her all the time. A few weeks after this, at the start of August, Erik entered in the 1989 Boys Junior National Tennis Championship with his friend Michael Joyce. Up to this point, his dad had really been micromanaging his tennis career, and this tournament was a way to win back the family pride after it having been lost through the burglaries. Unfortunately, unlike his friend Michael, who got to the quarterfinals of the singles, Erik only made it to the second round of qualifying. Jose was absolutely livid over Erik's failure, to the point he created a whole big scene at the tennis match, and then when they got home, locked himself in Erik's room with the boy in question. They didn't come out for a while. Shortly after this, a tearful Erik approached Lyle after there had been another shouting match at the family dinner. They spoke in private, and it was in this moment Erik revealed something to Lyle that made him start seeing red. Yet they didn't think they could act on it. Not yet. Unfortunately, that is it for today, but part 2 will be coming out next week. So as always, thank you for watching.